Really delighted to have this session on results blind review. I think if you think about our AM session, you think about the topics that were covered on publication bias, the fascinating talk on stat check, the work on specification search, and you combine that with what we know about the file drawer problem and whatnot, we really get the sense that a number of the problems and issues that we face in this open science transparency community is flows directly from a world in which publication is often based on the nature of results. All of these issues, if the p-value you get didn't enter into the publication decision, presumably people wouldn't be trying to manipulate those statistics or specification searching and whatnot. So that aspect of the publication process is obviously central, and I think we got a range of interesting perspectives in the course of the morning and strong views on some issues about what the problems are and what the solutions might be, which is great to have that sort of forum here at BITS. But what if we go to the source of the problem next? And I think this is what this panel is all about. What if we go to the source of this concern about publication being dependent on the nature of results and think about a publication process that's independent of the results that you come up with? That's really what we're going to focus on here today. And this type of approach sometimes goes by different names. The articles can be called registered reports or results blind review. And we're absolutely delighted to have a group of panelists here today who have a lot of experience with these issues as journal editors, running research projects that use these, that touch on these issues. So let me just go down the list that's up here. We have Eich, the former editor of Psychological Science, who did a lot of pioneering work while editor there. There's Skip Lupia, who's going to talk about a new election research pre-acceptance competition that is very much in this space. We have Bobbie Spellman, the former editor of Perspectives on Psychological Science, and really a leader in the transparency movement within psychology and beyond. And then Daniel Lakens, guest editor of Social Psychology. I'm really excited to hear what they have to say and really think about ways to move these issues forward. I have some questions here, and the audience, I'm sure, has lots of questions, but maybe to start, what we could do is have each of you say a few words about the work you've done in this area of results blind review, your experience with it, and a brief perspective on it. And maybe, I don't know how long each of you should take, a few minutes to go through that. And then I have one or two questions, and then we'll open it up, because that's really, I think, the fun part about the BITS gatherings as we've had them is having contrasting views and opinions going around and see where the dialogue takes us. I don't know, Bobbie, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I should do this? This is good? Okay, so I was editor-in-chief of Perspectives on Psychological Science from 2010 to 2016, and a lot of things happened over those years. I do want to tell you a few things about what we did at the journal, and I also want to say a few things about what I believe. So a major initiative at the journal was something called registered replication reports. And the way this works is that somebody, or usually some group of researchers, approaches the journal and they say, look, there is some research out there, some study, and it's important, and we believe that it needs replication. We used to talk about something called replication value. What makes you think that this particular article is worthy of spending a lot of time getting replicated? And it would be things like, it's been cited a lot, it's fundamental to a theory, people talk about it all the time, it's been in the news all the time, not things like, I don't believe it, even though we're a little worried that that was sometimes the motivation for it. And the plan was to, once we approved that, write up a protocol. How would you test it? How do you replicate? Like a million steps. Two of the things I think we learned a lot in the past 3 years is, first of all, it's really difficult to do as close to an exact replication of another study as you can. And then, of course, as people have talked about earlier today, what does it really mean to have replicated the study? So they would write up a protocol as best as they could. Then we would get in touch with the initial authors and make sure that they approved that the protocol was as similar to it as it possibly could be. And then they put out a call, get a whole bunch of people to actually do the replications. It was accepted at the journal before that point. That is, we knew we were going to publish it, and the data were going to come in, and they were going to answer, we hoped, some question about the paper. And it's because we viewed this particular study as being so important to merit all of that involvement. So, although there are things I like about the way we did replication reports and things I don't, I'm really glad that we did it. And I think it reflects a value that I have, which comes from this. I mean, there's an infinite number of studies that could be run in the world, right? Why are we doing this particular one? And you have to answer that question, and I think an important answer to that question is, no matter how this study turns out, it will be interesting. And it really annoys me when people talk about things like a study didn't work, the experiment didn't work. What does that mean? I mean, unless you're a chemist, did something blow up? Did the research participants refuse to answer the questions? Did they get up and walk out of your lab? Which, by the way, would be a pretty interesting thing as it is. But shouldn't it be valuable whether you get what you want or you don't get what you want? Because look, you've got data. You had thought went into doing this study because you could have done a million other studies. And so it should mean something whether you get the result you want or you don't get the result that you want. So I think that the story of why an experiment or a study or whatever is interesting, why it would mean something important if it turned out this way or if it turned out another way, is paramount to deciding whether or not we should publish something. Not that you just said, you know, how many introductions to a study have you read where somebody says, oh, so we thought we would study this and this, and we thought we'd see what would happen if we did this and this, and we predicted X. And you have no idea why they predicted X. They just made up, we predicted X, and you know what's going to happen. It's whatever they predicted because, you know, that they predicted it because that's what turned out. And, you know, I think we need to go back to the real basics and say, this would be an interesting thing no matter how it turns out, and this is something I want to spend my resources on and want to do. So I think it's not just for major replication reports. I think it's for small studies, for stuff that we do, and we ought to have more results blind review.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm Eric Eich. I was going to say a couple things about registered reports right now because I guess Ted's idea was just some general background about where we're at right now, and then we'll get into more specific things later. And with that in mind, actually, besides just some own thoughts about registered reports, I picked on some friends who are good at this stuff as well, and I asked them to send comments to these same questions and then whether I could share them with you. I don't have time to get into that all today, but if you're interested, I'm happy to send you copies of what they had as well, so you get more bang for the buck. Instead of 4 of us answering, you get 6 other people. So I got, yeah, right, bit larger sample size, can't go wrong with that. So Rob Kale, who was my predecessor at Psych Science, and then Steve Lindsay, who's now the successor. I also got Roddy Roediger. These are people more familiar if you're in psychology, who's been very active in a lot of things about new science sort of movements. Brian Nosek, Yuri Simonson, and also Chris Chambers, who's associate editor at Cortex. And they've been really most instrumental, most focal in doing with registered reports. But for my background, just to tie it into what Bobbie was doing in the time, because it's all sort of emerged over a relatively short period of time. I became editor in July of 2015, and for several months before that was sort of boot camp just to get used to see what was going on.
Not 2015, July of
2012, sorry. It's 2012, sorry. I skipped. It's called amnesia, which I study, but I also experienced. 2012, how time flies. So during boot camp at that time, Psych Science had been a pretty successful journal, and it seemed like it would just sort of continue things going really well. And then to my horrors, I met Leif Nelson and his colleagues Yuri Simonson and Joe Simmons. And Joe, I think, wrote and said, just out of nowhere, they were going to be in Vancouver for some conference or other. And they had a paper coming out in Psych Science. I think it was in press at that time. And could we come by and just sort of talk about it? And that was, and we did. And I treated you for lunch, and what I got in return was a complete apple cart being turned over, but all for good, because what they were really interested in, and which didn't take very long to appreciate, was it wasn't going to be business as usual anymore, that things needed to change, and we followed a lot of their suggestions that they had. One for pre-registered reports, that Psych Science sort of tinkered with that a little bit, but Bobbie took that on instead, and that ended up being just a really, really great thing to do, but otherwise made changes. And I think have kind of raised the bar, at least in the field. That's as much I'll say about that. I'll come back to specific things about registered reports where I think they're good or bad, and I might pick up some of the themes that were raised by Yuri and other people. Almost every one of these people I'm mentioning before, their responses are the same, where they say, in principle, registered reports are great, but, and then the but is some practical thing that comes along, except for Brian Nosek, who I really like him because he can see they're just wonderful, just flat out. So I'll come back to that later, though.
Thank you. I have a couple slides. Should I be up? Okay.
Right arrow, and I should move out.
All right. Should I be over? Is it okay if I'm here?
Yeah.
All right. So I've been asked to talk about the election research pre-acceptance competition. And first, I just want to say a bit about why you would do this, because all these things are a little bit of work, and that's one of the questions we were asked about. So there are a lot of changes in the world, and people are asking questions about the legitimacy of all kinds of information, in particular with questions about why should we believe science. And so I think that all of us have both normative reasons and professional and economic reasons to be able to answer that question more than we have in the past. There's lots of competition for the resources that are now delivered to science, and if science isn't a better way of knowing in some context than less expensive kinds of information, like all the stuff on the internet, then it's a little harder to make that case. So I like to ask the question, how can we increase the value of science to people who can benefit from it? And how can science more effectively serve social constituents? And these aren't just for each other. My career has evolved in certain ways. I now spend a lot of time this far from presidents and prime ministers and finance ministers, talking about social science and how it can help them improve service delivery and reduce poverty and things like that in their countries. And at that point, if there's a gap between what we observe and what we report, it's a problem. Right? The way that thousands or millions of people live are affected by that. And if you're young, the chain between the work that you're doing and the decisions that people make and important, the chain's not that long. Right? So it's great that there's so much energy in terms of wanting to do science in a more reliable and rigorous way, but there's also a bigger picture that we're all a part of. So in thinking about how to do that, I always talk about three factors. One is more effectively communicating what we know. We're really bad at communicating, but that's another story. But suppose we got better at communicating, right? Then we'd want truth and labeling, right? So if we're telling the stories, I had a single idea, and then I ran a single regression, and then truth was revealed to me, and now I'm giving it to you, right? But in fact, what we did is run 95 regressions and pick the one we like best. That's a problem. It's not a problem to run 95 regressions and pick the one you like best, as long as you tell people that that's what you did, right? Because then they can interpret it. But that's, there you go. So truth and labeling, and that's what I'll focus on here. There's also stakeholder engagement, which we can get to, why is information valuable to other people? So with this whole thing in mind, a lot of you woke up on Wednesday, November in mind, and you asked some version of this question. Actually, a lot of your versions had swear words in between these two questions, but you were asking this. And that's what people are trying to figure out now. What happened, what does it mean, and so forth. So to answer these questions, a lot of people go to data, and one place where scholars go is the American National Election Studies, which is a National Science Foundation funded study, but it actually has a longer history than that. It has a time series component that goes back to 1948, and it's widely recognized as the gold standard of election studies. There's a lot of emphasis on getting the sampling right and question wording and putting out data that people can really use. So there was an opportunity for us to advance transparency with the ANES. So let me tell you why. The ANES puts out some products. You can look at them at their website. I used to run the National Election Studies. They're seen as the gold standard. The design is pre-post. They do in-person elections for thousands of Americans. They go and talk to them for like an hour and a half before the election, and then after the election, they revisit people, so they're still in the field right now. And one of the things that we have to do is we have to post data and rigorous documentation, because when somebody gets one of our data sets, we want them to know as much as they can about the mechanism that put a 3 in the 738th row in the 49th column, to know where that came from. But there's an amazing opportunity with this study, okay? They release their data months after the election, typically around the beginning of April, and that's because they're in the field till the end of December. There's a lot of checking of the data. They not only release individual data, they merge it with contextual data about where they live, the neighborhood, and so forth. It takes a couple months. So the data is released in April, but the question is, would they agree to release their questionnaires early, like in August? And the answer is yes. So if you do that, now you have this window. You have a window where people could see the code book of a study 8-9 months before anyone has access to the data. So with that opportunity in mind, we had this idea. Because a lot of pre-registration, you could pre-register designs, and everyone could know that no one had seen the data when you did it. And that's really interesting, because when a lot of people think about pre-registration, they think about experiments. But there's no reason to limit pre-registration to experiments. So we approached the Arnold Foundation with this idea, and they liked it not only because it was about the election, but they thought of this as a possible demonstration project for the power of pre-registration for observational research. So that led to this, the Election Research Pre-Acceptance Competition. That's the front page of our website. What really happened? We wrote that months ago. But in any case, there's a couple simple rules. So here's what it is. First, they're not supposed to come up all at once. You pre-register a design. We work with the Center for Open Science. We have our own little corner of that world. We have a registry. You pre-register a design using the ANES study. And you can do it right now or for a couple months, and it's a lockbox. We're going to lock it the day that the American National Election Studies releases their data. So you pre-register a design. Then you write a paper, and it can have the pre-registered design in it. You can have other data too, but it's got to have this, and you submit it to a participating journal. We got 9 of the top journals in political science to agree to pre-review, to review articles before they have the data. So I'm not eligible, but if you and I were writing a paper, we could write the whole paper just without the numbers in the tables and the little thing we write in the end after the numbers. Okay? So you send that to a journal. The journals have agreed to review them, and then if you get published, that it has, that's great. You also get a cash prize. You get $1,000 up front, and then you get $1,000 when we send you to a panel that you'll appear on that does this. We have great partners that helped us design and implement it, including BITS, Laura and John Arnold Foundation that funded it. All these folks have helped us implement it. These are the top journals, the American Journal of Political Science, APSR, these are the top 2 journals in political science. Public Opinion Quarterly is the top journal in that field, so we're starting at the top. And one critical thing just about this whole, they've agreed to share reviews. So we're looking at a speed thing too. So right now you send an article to one journal. They don't want it for some reason. They will share their manuscript and the reviews with other people. You can agree to have this, and that can make it happen quicker. So the idea is we're trying to build incentives for both pre-registration and give journal editors, we're also financially supporting the journals who are participating in this so that they can learn how to do this more effectively. So anyways, we're hoping to add clarity. And thanks for your time.
All right, hi everyone. So my name is Daniel Lakens, and together with Brian Nosek, I guest edited a special issue that was pretty early in applying this registered replication format because we were doing a special issue on replication studies, and we thought it would be a good idea to try to normalize a replication study as much as possible, which in part meant that when the results were published, people would sort of agree like, okay, this was a good study, no need to write commentaries about this, it's just a study that's well designed. And we thought it would make sense to make sure that the original authors agree with this, so beforehand people have to specify what they want to do, write down exactly what kind of research they'll do, and then that will be sort of what's done, and then people just collect the data, and then we can publish this. And it was an interesting experience. I think we did a lot of different studies all at once. So instead of, for example, the registered replication report, you do one and then you can learn, and you do another one. We had a lot of different studies, very different types of research as well. And for every one, we actually had to sort of figure out, like, how can we do this? So we started about in 2012, I think, and 2011, actually, I think. And the special issue came out in 2014. And it was an interesting educational experience, I think, in how to do this. And even now, I still sort of think, how can it be that we took like 100 years to figure out how to do this, if it's so important? But I think it's great that we sort of started. And yeah, I'm happy to share any sort of insights or answer any questions about this.
Great. Thanks for those overviews. Let me just start off the discussion with a question that I have, and maybe it'll spark some responses from the panel. Different fields have moved at different rates in adopting registered reports, results-blind review. So in my own field of economics, and there's a bunch of economists in the room, we've actually been very slow at adopting them. I was discussing this with some folks yesterday, there's a little bit of interest emerging now in a few journals, but we're basically years behind. And a couple of years ago, when there was a push around the top guidelines, and econ journals were not at all receptive. So the question I have for each of you, since each of you have had some success in advancing this approach, this sort of article format, this review protocol in your own discipline, in your own journal. So there's really two parts of the question. One is, what were the politics like? And I think Eric hinted at some of this in his comments, but I'd like to hear more of what were the politics like within your community, within the editorial boards, among colleagues, and sort of how did you make the politics work to actually implement changes? So that's one. If you can talk about it legally, Bobbie. And second, how much of the resistance revolved around specific intellectual concerns around this format, and what were those concerns? So I think I think we can all introspect about what they might be, but I'd like to hear kind of the intellectual argument against it that you heard, and how you may have overcome those concerns or other political factors in pushing through these very important policy changes. And I don't know, Bobbie, do you want to start again, just going down the row again?
Sure. Here's how Eric and I did it. We just did it. So Dan Simons and Alex Holcomb came to us with the idea. They actually approached Eric at the journal first. Let's do these registered replication reports. Eric and I were like, well, should it be in his journal, which had more short empirical papers, or my journal, which is bigger theory journal? And we thought they would work better in my journal. So we go to our board and we say, hey, we're thinking about doing this. And good things did not happen. We got questions like, why would anybody want to replicate somebody else's study? Or statements like, I would never want somebody to try to replicate my research. Oh, wait, you want it on a shelf somewhere and no one's ever going to read it. The only people who would ever try to replicate things are people who are either incompetent or who have no ideas of their very own. And so we got a lot of bad stuff, but we just did it anyway, because there were people at the top of our organization who thought it was fine, and they said, if we do it and it's bad, we get crucified, not them, so that's okay. But there was one other thing I was going to say about it. No, I can't. What was...
Intellectual counterarguments?
Yes, exactly. So there were these reactions, these really visceral reactions that weren't so much intellectual as just, this sounds wrong, the people who are doing it are evil, no good could come of it, without being intellectual arguments. And then people pulled out arguments like, well, there are some data that can't be shared because they're under confidentiality. Yes, there are some. We're not saying all of it, we just want this to be a sort of default. This is for sharing your data. And there were things like, Well, what do you mean I can only say one hypothesis? I want to be able to be free to explore all my data and to write about where the data goes. And it's like, we're not stopping you. You can do that. It's just the default is you talk about what your plan is in advance. And it just seemed like all these objections were coming up, even though there were either exceptions or meritless, or people weren't just listening to the idea of, we want to change the norms, but that doesn't mean you can't do the things that are necessary to do. And I find that these arguments still come up all the time against registered reports, against pre-registration, against sharing data, against all these other things, that as if it's a blanket thing that always has to be done for whatever kind of research you have in any context, as opposed to, look, we know sometimes it just doesn't work that way.
I agree with what Bobbie was saying. I think also just that, I guess two things. One, sort of a more practical and then a more general sort of statement about this is that I think also that my sense was that a lot of the people that were most bitterly opposed to registered reports or a lot of other initiatives are not surprisingly the ones who were also very, very successful in the field currently. And why would they want anything that's going to potentially upset the apple cart and change things around? I mean, it's not particularly rocket science. I mean, it's kind of basic, and that still pervades a number of thoughts about this to this day. That said, I think that for people that are still, as I am, I think all of us here that are in very much sympathetic and in favor of actively supporting registered reports, there are some tricky things that still haven't really been worked out. And just to suggest a couple is what's the connection between actually getting the grant funding to actually carry out a study, and then down the road you're actually going to publish something. And the reason I'm just bringing that up is because that, I mean, if you want to get an NIH or NSF grant or NSERC where I am or whatever, it doesn't matter, some kind of basic science grant, what you really need is a strong connection between like a really good idea, some kind of cool idea, and a really good method, basically some sort of method. And that's basically what you have. But you're not really usually working with any kind of real evidence. Otherwise, why would they give you all the money to do new stuff, right? So that's a fun foundational thing. But that said, that's been the sort of the break between what we're talking about when you get funding versus now registered reports. Because when a grant panel, and all of us, I think most of us here serve on grant panels, you're looking for that connection, which is all you would have, by the way, in a pre-registered report, right? A really cool idea. Here's sort of my method. Take it on that basis. That's, I'm simply saying, that's the same logic that underlies getting a grant or not getting a grant. But with a grant, though, at least most agencies I ever dealt with, there's not just implicit, there's explicit encouragement to the investigators to nose around, to try out different ideas. If something isn't working, to deviate from it, try out something else. And that's perfectly, utterly appropriate. And I think it's also perfectly, utterly appropriate to do that now going forward when you're reporting the research, except you should also have had like a record of what your original expectations were, right? Your predictions and so forth. And you need to be honest about reporting them, whether they succeeded or not, worked or not, however you define it. But that shouldn't then just constrain you to only those things. You can then go on to say, look, this is what I promised to do, this is what happened. Hindsight's 20/20, or the data turned out differently, so I pursue these other tracks. I think that's also good science, is the combination between these two. And somehow, in other words, like to sort of marry the process that you have to go through to get the funding itself, and then the process you need to go to when you publish later. So that's one thing I was going to say. The other, just sort of briefer, is that at least in psychology, it's not the case, put it another way, that I think that registered reports make a lot more sense in certain areas of psychology than they do in others. We all have very variegated areas. Psychology is no different. And I think that as a sort of the cartoon kind of version, I think that where registered reports is where, or results blind reviewing, or call it what you will, where they really work best for us, is under two conditions: where power is cheap, statistical power is cheap, and where there's clear a priori predictions, hypotheses are possible. If you have a combination of those two things, then I think registered reports make a lot of sense. what that would include, for instance, just say in sort of my areas, I mean, sort of like, say, in psychophysics, or if you're doing, say, in visual attention or perception, you don't need very many participants, but you can test the bejesus out of them, thousands of trials, and that's where you get your power from. And that works really, really well. On the other hand, if you're doing neuropsychology, broadly construed, it tends to be very much after the fact hypothesizing. If you're doing neuroimaging, that's very expensive, and it's very hard to have the resources that you would need to get to a high enough bar where you're going to have really, really high power. So I'll leave it at that. We'll pick up some other themes on this later. But so I think that even within psychology, people that are pro the registered reports, it's understanding that it works well, at least currently, for certain fields more so than it may be for others.
All right. Yes. So maybe to extend a little bit on that, I think it works very well for some of these prototypical, like the ideal case of science. And sometimes it's very easy to explain this format to very young scholars because it adheres almost to what you think should happen in science. You have a theory, it makes a prediction, and you test it. So in that way, it seems really straightforward. But I think some of the concern is that it devalues other types of research, so exploratory research, which also can give really important insights, and people are a bit worried that if you have a more appreciation for very conformatory research, where you have a very fixed alpha level, you know that you tested something at a fixed alpha level, then it will make everything else less valuable. And I think that's a bit of a challenge, and it's easier to say why a pre-registered study gave you some useful information than to do exactly the same for exploratory research. And that's also why people wanted to present it like it was part of a story, a narrative they already had. And I think people have to relearn how to write a very good exploratory paper where you say, well, I had no clue that this was going to happen, but I can give you some good reasons, not just statistically, not just because the p-value was there, but some other very good reasons why this is really exciting. And if we learn that, then maybe there's a bit more balance, but now there's a bit uncertainty what we'll do with these other types of formats and how well they'll be appreciated. And I think that's important. If you think about this ideal, then it's very easy to think, how can you have a problem with pre-registration? But if you think about more, also the social part, so there's a big social part, especially when you do pre-registered replications. We were very naive in going into this special issue where we thought, well, this is the scientific ideal, and how can you have a problem with that? And we totally underestimated the importance of the social component that's involved in these kind of projects. I think you have to keep all that in mind. Yeah.
So I'm from a different field. I'm from political science, and the pushback is not so much about pre-registration, it's just transparency generally. I don't think there's a lot of specialization. Political science is a discipline where people are brought together by interest in a context, not by a shared paradigm. So you have people with backgrounds that are more like an economist, some statistics, some more like philosophy, or some like anthropology, and everybody's in the same department. And so there's some tribal warfare kind of associated with that, like what's the best way of knowing, and is ways of knowing other than mine valid, and so those permeate the discipline. So when the transparency thing came along, initially what was awesome about it was that people from a lot of these different research traditions were working together trying to figure out, is there a meta standard that works for all of us? And initially it wasn't controversial. So there were a group of people, mostly qualitative scholars, and I was included, where we got the American Political Science Association, worked with them to change their ethics guide. And remarkably, just because political science is really contentious, the changes to the ethics guide, which said transparency is a meta standard, and we expect it of one another. We expect data sharing, transparency about how we analyze things, transparency about how we produce data. These get written into the ethics guide, and the APSA Council passes it unanimously. And I'm just like, that's such an outlier, if you know anything about that group, that it's unanimously. So everything's fine, and then we decide to start implementing things, and that's when the stuff hits the fan. So they're in an endeavor called DART, which you can look up, Data Access and Research Transparency. We got initially 23 of the editors of the top journals in the discipline signed a joint statement saying, we're committing to this, and in this far off date in the future, January 2016, we will all have new practices about transparency, data sharing, and so forth, and we reserve the right not even to review your article if you don't meet these standards, right? So yeah, then the stuff hit the fan. So then there was a petition signed by 1,100 members of the American Political Science Association asking to delay this or more. And some of the criticisms, well, the main criticism was you quants are trying to put one over on us, right? Others were, you're going to devalue our kind of research, right? Because we can't imagine how to replicate it. Others were, in political science, we often work with vulnerable populations, right? It could be a vulnerable citizen in our country who doesn't really want their neighbors to know who they voted for, or it can be somebody in another country where, there's real violence and bloodshed and things of that nature. So a lot of legitimate concerns there. So the petition happens, but here's just one thing about the politics. I have when you're working with journal editors and they have the leverage, there's two assumptions I have about journal editors. The first is that their current job takes 25 hours a day and 8 days a week, so you can't ask them to do anything new. The second is that journal editors are serial autocrats. Just stop and think about that for a second. If you've ever run a journal, like even if you're doing triage all the time, and so you can't tell them what to do. And the problem with this petition, I think, was they tried to tell them what to do. So the consequence of the petition was that one of the initial journals said, okay, we're out. Another said, okay, we're going to delay for qualitative work. And 7 other journals contacted us out of the blue and said, can we join? So the net effect of the petition was a massive increase in the number of journals signing the petition. So anyways, that's the politics of it. And where we are now, there's this amazing effort amongst qualitative scholars. If you look it up, it's called Qualitative Transparency Deliberations. And they're now working out systems of transparency for that kind of work. So they own it now. It's awesome. In terms of when pre-registration works best, I have an idea. And it's like every model is an analogy, right? We try and take a high-dimensional phenomenon and compress it into a low-dimensional object called a model, and then we use the model to produce a result. So analogies are by necessity imperfect, and one of the things we always want to know about analogies is, do they apply to my case, right? So pre-registration, I think, is sort of this is really valuable when the applicability of an analogy to a particular set of case that a field understands well is imperiled. Because we could pre-register anything, but when what's at stake in the vitality of the analogy is high, I think that's when you want to go after it. Because otherwise, it's like a one-off study. I mean, and it's so hard to pre-register and to replicate and so forth that the value added there is more difficult. So.
That was really fascinating. Just a couple of reactions that I have listening to this. Again, thinking about the experience across fields is, the politics has worked out so differently in different fields, and for sort of idiosyncratic reasons, namely the fact that you guys were the editors in psychology in 2012, 2013, when Leif and co-authors and others and Brian Nosek started raising these issues in psychology. You guys were at the helm and pushed for certain changes and managed to sort of institutionalize them in some dimensions. In economics, we have had a lot more open data sharing, and we've had a registry, an RCT registry now for years. Again, the process the politics of how that was implemented seems somewhat random. It just, a certain person was in a certain position in the association at the time, and political science has its own history where, again, there were much broader statements in political science on the principles, as Skip just said, very early on, way more than economics. But on some of the implementation issues, maybe we've led or other fields have led. So I think it's a fascinating sort of landscape. And as I think back to the first BITS meeting 4 or 5 years ago, and Leif was presenting there, at that time, and Kevin's there, some other people in the room, at that time, like none of these changes 4 or 5 years ago had been put in place. And we were all just grappling for leverage. And it's interesting that we've gotten partial leverage in different fields on some dimensions and not in others. But still, I think far from where we'll be in 5 years. I mean, I think if you think about the last 5 years and how much has changed, it can make one optimistic about what the next 5 years might look like. Okay, we have quite a bit of time for questions, and I think I see a lot of hands already. So maybe we can just let me just go from right to left around the room. If you want to start over there. Oh, sorry.
I was wondering what the possibility is for replication before publication. So, I mean, Jonathan Scholler has started a project about that. I think there's a group in Europe that does something called the Pipeline that started something like that. Is that feasible, and when, and how would that fit with pre-registration?
Should we take a few? Maybe we'll take 2 or 3 questions, and then folks can weigh in on the ones they're interested in. Is that okay? Or okay. Oh yeah, whatever the panel prefers. Do you guys want to go question by question? I mean.
I was actually going to ask something similar, considering what you were saying about exploratory analysis. Maybe in such cases, one could also, as a pre-registration requirement, you could ask of self-replication of the results from the exploratory analysis before publication.
So maybe one way, so not everybody is practicing pre-registration. That's also fine. And one thing that is interesting, and sometimes editors do it without having a pre-registered format, is they say, well, this sounds pretty exciting, but I can just see it's incredibly exploratory. And they'll say, well, it sounds really interesting. What I want you to do is replicate it yourself. So it could be in a group, right? Some people are trying out different ways to organize these kind of internal replications before it goes in. But some of my favorite editors sometimes just say, it sounds exciting. I'm all for exploratory research. I don't care what happens after the replication you do, right? It can show the same result, it can show a different result, but I just want more data on it, and then I'm accepting it sort of as it is now, but collect more data. That happens sometimes. So that would be a good sort of half-between solution.
On the question of replication before publication, I think in the short and medium run, it's not feasible as a general practice. And the reason is it's like incredibly hard to do for lots of different types of research. In my discipline, there's one journal, the American Journal of Political Science, that effectively does that. It's been referenced here earlier. And you saw Gabe Lenz, I don't know if Gabe is still here, talked about the number of studies that they could kind of replicate, and it was close to 100% for a lot of them. Those of us in political science were saying, that's like 100% more than 10 years ago. Like 10 years ago, graduate classes were regularly run where you couldn't replicate any findings. But here's the issue. Bill Jacoby at AJPS can do it because they are the #1 or #2 journal in the discipline, and he has leverage. It's very expensive. The Midwest Political Science Association that runs it is committing a lot of money to have the staff to allow him to do that, and he outsources a lot of it to the Odin Institute in North Carolina. It's really expensive and labor intensive. So I think people like him can provide a template where if other people can figure out how to do that less expensively, and I thought the Gertler proposal of doing it randomly is interesting, but I think just in the short run, it's like really, really expensive. So if we can figure out templates for making it less expensive, then I think we'll have more adoption. I also think this kind of, if the top journals do it first, it's more likely to be an aspirational good. And I personally, I think that's where it has to start.
I basically agree with that, but just to pick some other aspects. We had a talk earlier, was really interesting, just was making the point about there's a difference between reanalysis, replicating a code, and so forth. I mean, this is not some just one simple thing when we're talking about replication. The most minimum would be, like, can you yourself replicate the same analyses you just did? If not, that's really a problem, you would think. But if we're talking more aspirationally beyond that, I mean, as an editor, I mean, what you'd be most convinced by is to say, like, I found this really cool phenomenon. I think it's interesting. I can pre-register it myself, but better still, I'd really like to see if somebody else, another lab, could do it as well. Then that would be really interesting to know. But that said, that really raises the bar to an unbelievable sort of level. The question is, though, since we're doing science, why would we not want to raise the bar in that level, or under what conditions we would like to do so? So just something to think about, but it's not just this monolithic thing when you think of replication, even done by yourself, registered or not. It's something separate from that.
Yeah, I was going to say a lot of the things that those guys said, but let me just add one more thing I was just thinking about. When you publish something, except for those people on the board that Eric and I faced, most of us would like other people to read our studies and try to replicate our studies and try to do something with it that builds on it and adopts it into theory and things like that. So just as a potential alternative, maybe the thing that we're getting wrong is, when a lab replicates its own study. I mean, that's good, and it's a first start, but it means a lot less, I think, than if somebody else did it. So maybe the idea is to get that thing out and published, but then to make sure we don't end up with the file drawer problem that we've always had with when somebody tries to replicate it and somebody else tries to replicate it and somebody else tries to replicate it and they can't, that we've lost all that information and it goes away. Maybe the idea is to be able to get things out that seem potentially interesting and then to have as many other people who are as interested try to replicate it and collect all the information and know in the long run at that point whether things are working or not.
Maybe we can get 2 or 3 more. Lots of hands. This is fantastic. You two, Sean, and then gentleman over here. Yeah, both of you guys. Go ahead.
Okay, well, maybe I'll start. So I'm a serial autocrat for a particular journal, so Stress and Health. And it's a fairly niche journal. It has sort of multidisciplinary submissions. Quite a few psychological articles are submitted. And we introduced a replication report type of article, which coexists with other, the sort of more standard submissions. And to date, we've had 3 submissions. And we've published, for various reasons, we've published none so far. So my question would be, is how might we go about engaging authors to submit for these kinds of articles? Because we want to solicit and to increase the submissions in that space.
Yeah? So, shall I quickly answer? Or, yeah, is that okay?
Oh, yeah, okay, go ahead, yeah.
When we did the special issue, we had a very similar sort of, we had no idea how many people would submit. And I think what you need to do is, we have to make sure that the rewards are big enough. And I think currently, especially for the people who build on other people's work, it's very often maybe more junior researchers who say, this sounds interesting, I want to build on it. And we're not making it very easy or attractive for them. So I think there needs to be, from the journal, probably a more active approach, soliciting maybe about specific topics that are interesting, so that, and then in collaboration with some of the people involved in it, so that the threat of, being the one who say, I want to replicate this, and then having to tell the original researchers that this is happening, if these people are on board, it makes it a little less scary for people to join. And then you can have multiple studies, make a sort of coherent package where you examine a theory from different perspectives, something like that. I think it has to be more active, and I hear the same thing from many other journals that say, okay, so we did our thing. We opened up the, come to us, and then people don't come. So there has to be a little bit more activity.
Yeah, I would think about just creating a focal point, right? Because it's very scary and it's really hard. But if you can create like special attention to it, or a spotlight, like where you can say we're gonna have a special issue, or we're gonna have a special part of an issue. In some ways, you're creating a currency that doesn't exist, kind of like the Center for Open Science badges. They're free, but people want them. I have used this tactic a number of times, and I'm amazed at how well it works. Diana Mutz and I, 15 years ago, created tests, something called tests, time-shared experiments for the social science, allowed people to run, we would run people's experiments for them. So this sounds, for free, it sounds like great, except for like the first 7 or 8 months, nobody sends us anything, right? Because I'm like, I don't know how to do this, or they can't really be giving it away. So I've told this before, so we did something, we created a focal point. We said, okay, well now, we had rolling admissions. You could just send it whenever you want. We said, okay, we're gonna have a special competition, and the deadline is this day. All right, that's what we did. and a deadline. And we got a huge spike in proposals. And then the constant term was like, higher. So we said, all right, let's have another one. So we did. And we had this, our submissions were, and they stayed up, right? So it's, creating a focal point, creating gold stars, it's just a way to focus attention, but it also signals your commitment to the idea. And it's free.
Are you sure you're not a psychologist?
I think he is. I think by default. I think actually along those lines, like for psych science, we were one of the first to adopt like the open COS badges, and because unlike in econ, for instance, and some other areas that are already far well ahead, neuroscience, for also, where it's now de rigueur to everybody to share their materials, share their data, things like that. In psychology, we're not nearly there, so the idea with this was sort of like in the Sunstein-Thaler kind of sense of just trying to nudge people along. And that worked well with two badges, in terms of sharing your data and sharing your materials. But when I left, it was 25% or so of the articles received them. I think now it's around 40%. There was a recent paper compared that to other, I think 4 other major journals in psychology, and they're all around 1%, which is where we used to be before. That said, we also introduced a pre-registered badge, and that landed like a bomb. that basically went nowhere. So there's something else about, just I think it picks up on Skip's point that there's just a whole nother psychology about that versus, I can earn this badge, even though, as one wag put it, it was written up somewhere, they said even the title of their article was that even psychologists respond to meaningless rewards, which was altogether appropriate, but they don't respond to the reward for something about the pre-registration. There's something else that's cooking down there that makes it unattractive to a lot of people.
Thanks. I think we're a good double act. He was curious how to get authors to submit. I'm curious how to get other editors to change their policies and procedures to do things like this. And I think you've spoken a lot to what David Mower would call journalology, the study of journals and how they function. It's apparently a thing now. And one of the things I've grown to appreciate that I didn't before in this realm is the impact of how the journal is set up. So is it a one-off journal by itself? Is it a journal that's part of a society? Is that society the publisher or working with the publisher? How big is that society? So I'd be curious to get your thoughts on how that has played into successes at your journals in doing this or other initiatives, successes at other journals of your colleagues, and failures as well. So that multi-level structure of the journal within other units.
So in terms of how to get journals to adopt things, again, what I said about 25/8 and serial autocrat is absolutely true. But the other thing that's problematic if you're trying to get a lot of journal editors is turnover. If you're trying to work with N journals, and journals on average turn over editors every 5 years, then you've got, N over 5, well, even more, let's say you've got N over 3 that are within a year of a transition, right? So that's really hard. So what we did is, this is going to sound counterintuitive. When you talk to editors, you have to commit to mostly listening. So the idea is, what is your aspiration? You're a journal editor. I can't ask you to do anything. I can't really ask you to change anything. But what do you want? What drives you? Why are you doing this? And I know with DART, we did this for like 3 years. We sat in rooms and we laid out, here's the opportunity, and then just tell us things. And then our job is to see, is there a non-empty intersection? Is there a set of things that this group of people says that they want? And then you build it from there. Right? But then when you do that, it's not you asking them to do something, it's you providing a service to them, helping them achieve an aspiration that they've already stated. I think that's the only way it works and is sustainable, because trying to, again, if you've been an editor, I can't tell you what to do. I have no, this is a dirty little secret, right? I have no leverage over journal editors. Like people, when this whole DART thing was happening, people call and tell the journal editors to stop. I'm like, what universe is that possible? Right? But if you can find their aspirations and help them achieve it through transparency, and a lot of them want more presence, and they want more, they want the work to be used, and they want to be taken seriously, and they want iconic cases where they say this makes a difference, this is an avenue towards that, and we will provide you with the support systems and the templates and the networks and the funding to do it. When you can tell that story, then journal editors are like, okay, I want to do this. Yeah.
I think we have more evidence that Skip is a psychologist after that last day.
I don't have much more to add to that. I think that the question particularly was about organizations and in that aspect, and that, again, this is like an N of 1, so this is probably not going to replicate any other place. But I think that it does make an enormous difference. Like in North America, there's, for psychology organization, the two big ones are American Psychological Association, which is vastly larger in all respects than is Association for Psych Science, which published Psych Science and Bobbie's journal. I think we had, 4 journals at that time? And they have maybe 40, 50, something like that. I mean, this isn't conjecture, this is just known fact that there's no way that they would have had any interest whatsoever, APA, of trying to do something. So we have the great good fortune to have the executives and other people who work there that were willing to take these chances, and they are really big chances. I did consult, actually, was asked for APA from their guy who was their executive, and to see what they could do in their part. And the furthest they were willing to go is to make a statement that we would maybe perhaps APA would be willing to consider making changes at some unknown place further down the road. And that was a major breakthrough. I mean, it was just, but that's pretty well sums it up where they're at.
Yeah, but I think we shouldn't lose the point that editors are often working with constraints. So publication committees or editor selection committees or whatever it is. So I know some editors who have been told not to behave in certain ways, not to implement enough open science, or else they're out. And it's not like you're the general and you have the army, you can take it with it. You're the editor, and when you're fired, you're fired. And so the pressure can, we were lucky to be able to act on our own. Some societies might push you one way or the other. Sometimes it could be ground up, one would hope, from the people, from the researchers in the different disciplines. But it's a community thing, right?
We're going to hit time soon, so let's take 3 in a row, and then everybody can respond to those 3 and have a last word. But does someone? Okay, so one. Let's get the other 2. These 3 here. Okay.
Yeah, I would like to ask a question on something very different, and that's the results blind review. So I think Barbara Spellman made this comment that in social sciences a study cannot fail. And I don't really believe that. I think an experiment can fail. Say if I have a non-significant result, you don't know why it's non-significant. It can be either because you just don't have enough power or just because a null hypothesis is true. If I have like a Bayesian analysis and I can get evidence for the null, then I can get 3 results. I can get like evidence for the alternative, evidence for the null, or I can get like a base factor of 1, and then just the data is noisy and I cannot do anything with the results. That means that I would see that study doesn't teach us anything then. So that sort of is like the study failed, and you cannot do anything. But you can only see that if you see the results, if the study is actually valuable or not. So that makes it hard for me to see how you can do results blind review, because the results do influence how important and how influential a study is.
Let's take the next 2, and then Bobbie will start out.
Should we review philosophy of science now or not?
Let's hear the next 2, and then Bobbie can lead off on the
Just kind of getting back to kind of what type of experiments or studies are kind of appropriate for this pre-registration or pre-result review. One of you mentioned, I can't remember who, the idea that in certain fields where it's very costly or prohibitively difficult to get data, like neuroscience or neuroimaging, I think was the example given. There's kind of a necessity for doing this kind of exploration to try and figure out what's in the data. But is there a case to be made for that makes it even more important to pre-register what your hypotheses are? Because if everybody's doing exploratory analysis all the time, you need to be able to distinguish, okay, what did you really go into? Because that carries a lot more weight.
I think it was me. It was saying about that as far as like psychophysics, as opposed to neuropsych, for instance, and maybe very different in those bases for some things. But that said, I am in favor of the idea that even with exploratory work where you can make register what you think is going to happen, and if it doesn't and you still have something meaningful that you can say afterwards, I think that's fine. It's just simply, this has been raised many times before. If we say, I think it was Skip was saying perhaps about you to do 95 regressions and you only report the one that worked, that's a whole nother deal. But to say that I was influenced, this is what I thought would happen. My area, actually, just as a footnote, this is way before any of this stuff happened, but as an example was, I do work in memory and amnesia, and there was, this way back in the 1960s, but just as a footnote to this, so the idea at that time, and it still is to this day, is that if I want to help you remember something, I need to give you some kind of query, a cue, a reminder. And the idea would be is that the more cue information you give, the better. So the thought experiment would be, is say, I'm going to read you 20 color names, random color names, and then you come back a month later and say, remember I read you a list of words? And you go, God, I don't remember that anymore. Color names. Oh, it helps a little bit, and you remember a few. And then suppose I say, well, the color names, and some of the colors I gave you, and this is true, was purple, red, and blue. Can you remember the others? And that helps a little bit more too. The interesting point though is that you hit a tipping point where if I read you before 20 color names and I give you the title itself and I give you say 17 of those color names and now you come up with the remaining ones, you have almost hopeless, right? That was completely contrary to any thought at the time. It'd be the more information, the better. And it turns out obviously you don't hit that part. That would have been a beauty of a study to pre-register in advance, even though the person at the time ended up being very famous, did this incredibly counterintuitive theory or experiment that proved a really interesting point. So I'm just trying to get a point across that even when you're trying something as a winger, if you can state why you think it was going to work this way and it turns out differently, that's still knowledge, right? That's important, and you don't have to worry about then things being harked or p-hacked and so on and so forth. So I think both of these they're not mutually exclusive. They can live together really well, even in early stages of research.
Maybe we can just turn to Ed for the last question and go down the road with final comments.
So my final question is exactly has been answered by you in what I think is the wrong way, that these two things can coexist. So let me tell you why I think they can. And let's understand there's artificial intelligence, which is carrying out a pre-programmed plan. We do a lot of that in our classrooms. And once you get finished programming the individual or committing your own plan, it's very easy to be very short-sighted and not make the real scientific breakthroughs that come from the abnormalities, the peculiar things. So I'm a big believer, particularly if you're talking about macroeconomics, which has sort of two traditions. One is this pre-commitment to what I think is a really dumb model of how the macroeconomy operates, which is rational expectations. And that you could carry out a pre-committed plan. The other one is this is a complex human system, and we're so far from understanding what it is, we got to have freedom. And if I get pre-committed, that's giving up freedom. And when it comes to Trump, I don't think that the pre-analysis plans would have been helpful because no one could predict what they would do in the event that Trump won the election. We do forecasting, and there's no way we could have done that forecasting because you think so much about what this implies about how the economy operates and how the political electorate is. And I think if you have a pre-committed plan, you're less likely to do the creative work. And there are some fields that are mostly exploratory and not normal science, I would say.
So many interesting comments. So maybe start with Dan. Oh, I said Bobbie, so let's start with Bobbie. She has maybe points from before, and then we'll come down the row to Daniel.
Oh, okay. I just want to sort of conclude with some maybe 3 points that connect to a lot of the things that just came up. One is, I think it was, I was going to say Popper, but now I'm not sure, who said that every piece of data is consistent with an infinite number of hypotheses, and every piece of data is inconsistent with an infinite number of hypotheses. Data are really valuable, but on their own, they can support an infinite number of hypotheses. And so what I think the endeavor we're all trying to do involve in is try to get good data, try to get good pieces, and then try to get more good pieces, and not lose the information that we're accumulating. And then the thing that I think, I mean, we're all working on that now, but the thing that I think is like the next frontier is to make sure that not only do we not lose it, but also that we connect it in ways that helps us come to more valuable and real conclusions about, our theories of everything. I said at the meeting earlier, we're so involved right now about building better bricks, right? Making sure all our research is good. We forget that we're supposed to be building better walls, but they said, don't say walls, say buildings or bridges or whatever it is. But we're all trying to make the pieces of our science better, but we really need to be connecting it and building on it better. And I think that means preserving all the information that we have. And so, I'm sorry I made this snide remark before, really. If you do get a null result, there are lots and lots of reasons that you might have gotten it. But remember, if you do get a non-null result, there's lots and lots of reasons that you might have gotten it. And so one study, whatever, standing on its own, doesn't tell you as much as all the bricks being put together and weaved in a nice way and creating bridges or walls or spaceships or whatever it is that we're doing here. Thank you, Bits.
Agreed.
I guess I'm still grappling with Ed's question, but I think here's a way that I think about the enterprise. There are multiple ways of knowing. There are multiple ways of validating a knowledge claim, and they compete in society. And scientific methods are one way. The key thing about sort of science is the intersubjectivity play, right? That is, if I make a scientific claim, the idea is it should be true for anyone who follows my process in terms of observations, categorization, analysis, and interpretation. So if that's why we value science, then we have this problem when what we observe and what we report are different. Now, I happen to believe that you can't actually eliminate that gap because like we can, just the way that conceptual frameworks evolve and when you think of it, but we can try and close it. And the more that we close the gap between what we observe and what we report, the more individually and collectively we can be seen as a credible source of intersubjective knowledge claims, which is, I think, like the key. If we lose that, I think we're not really valuable. So I think that's worth defending. And I think that's why the work that you've done and that everybody has done, I think it's a core to the continuing value of science.
Okay. So I understand this tension between pre-registration and exploration. I think that now we're doing pre-registration like a 4-year-old basically is talking and walking. And in 40 years, I'm probably going to sit here in the audience and there'll be some really smart young people tell me like, oh yeah, you know, these old guys thought you had to pre-register like this. They're so crazy. I mean, just as some examples, there's a lot of flexibility you can have. You can pre-register a huge amount of flexibility. My favorite is probably just by the name, the drop the loser design, which is done in medicine, where you start out with 3 or 4 conditions, you look at the data after a while, and you drop the losers, the things that are not working. And then maybe you add something or whatever. There's a huge amount of flexibility, and it's all worked out how we can control these things. We're not using that, right? I mean, not at all, but we could pre-register extremely flexible paths through the research that we want to do. So that's one approach, and another one is collecting enough data so that you have a reserved data set. You can explore everything in the one and then test it in the other. So we're not using all of these methods, but in 10 years, people will be saying everything that we are doing wrong and correct us and show much better ways of doing this. So I'm pretty sure we'll find a way that these two get really close together.
That was fascinating. Let me end with just one comment, a kind of a meta comment. I was really struck by Eric's comment earlier about upsetting the apple cart and how sort of the incumbent powerful figures in the field saw a lot of these new methods in transparency, not just results blind review, but replication and other tools as like a threat to their position. And I was really struck by that. I think it's a theme that comes through a lot. And I think the hope with a lot of these methods that a lot of us are trying to develop and use is that it is truly democratizing in some way in the field, that maybe under current norms or past norms are changing, but under the past norms, only the leading figures or those who are up on a pedestal would be able to challenge existing theory. If a really smart grad student or assistant professor or someone who wasn't at the most famous department challenged existing theory, people would assume that their experiment hadn't worked or they had messed up. And I think the thing that's so powerful about results blind review and pre-registration and the ability to replicate in an open, even-handed way is it changes the power dynamics in the field, because then the scientific approach is unassailable, or hopefully not unassailable, that's too strong, but the scientific approach is more rigorous and clearer to people. And I think that's one of the things that's exciting and promising about what we're doing is to democratize science. So voices aren't just shut down because they're not in the right country or school or status in the profession, but the science speaks for itself. And I think that's something maybe we can all try to embrace as part of the movement, really. Transparency can be a democratic movement within science. That would be a really wonderful outcome. So thanks to everybody on the panel. So we are going to go to about a 20, 30-minute overview session, the way we have in other annual meetings, to open the floor. Speaking of democratic participation and discussion, to get people's thoughts about next steps for BITS, to get your thoughts about things you heard or didn't hear, or exciting directions to go in the future. And as we've done in the past, maybe Kevin can lead the discussion, and I'll type up some notes, or or we can co-lead the discussion. So no structure here, more just reactions, thoughts, concluding remarks, themes you felt permeated the 2 days that we didn't tie together. Oh yeah.
Hi, I'm James Cerrito, JPAL, Poverty Action Lab at MIT. And one of the things I wanted to say actually is I'm happy to hear a lot of talk about the pre-publication, replication, reanalyses, because that's actually something we've made a goal to work on this year. And we have a plan to do, actually for the next 3 years, 36 of these. And we're offering up fellowships to graduate students. So if you are an advisor or if you are a grad student, I'd love you to check out our website and take a look at these, or at least pass the information on. But in general, if you have thoughts on how to really do this successfully and suggestions, I implore you to please come talk to me and help out and discuss these. But I don't know where it's going to go, so it's going to start in the spring, and we're going to continue to do it throughout the year. Hopefully, maybe at the end of or the next year's annual meeting, I'll be able to talk about what some of the outcomes were, what we found with doing this and kind of piloting this.
Go to applications.
Yeah, we can share all this.
BITS can circulate that.
Let me just write down.
Okay. Great. So especially things that sort of thoughts about what BITS can do to help out to kind of advance the movement, move things along, building infrastructure.
We discussed this a little bit earlier, and I feel like one of the things that would be super useful for junior researchers is, or just generally people that are doing replications of other people's work, is that we have no obvious set of norms and guidelines for how to contact and interact with our colleagues when we disagree with them, or when we replicated or fail to replicate them. And it just seems like I should be able to go somewhere and say, oh, this is how I do it. And if I get an email someday that says, hey, I failed to replicate your paper, I should have some, it would be nice to have some guidance to know how to respond, right? Because these are hard, they're emotionally challenging, they're intellectually challenging. The junior researcher often feels at a disadvantaged position, and I think that there's, with some guidance and some norms that we can develop openly, it would help smooth that process and get people past the initial emotional reaction to where they can engage intellectually, well and fairly. Productively.
How do we do that?
Form emails?
But I think if I could say one thing on that, I think that a bit of the earlier presentation by Paul kind of brought up a lot of the feelings and emotions around replications. But I think the hope is that this will be and should be a normal part of science, and we're in a kind of transitional phase where it's new and people are confused, and when no replications are done and you're targeted, you feel like you're targeted because no one's done it before, there's a reaction. But if we achieve our goals as BITS to normalize and mainstream and make it normal scientific practice to replicate each other, the ego isn't in it anymore. It's a normal part of science. So maybe that's overly optimistic, but I think the hope would be, thinking about the last 5 years, how much things have changed, the goal would be in 5 years, it's not anything out of the ordinary for folks to be doing lots of replication to make sure results are solid. It's a normal part of science. I think that would be something that our community could kind of get behind. But you're right that in the early stages, it can knock people off balance.
I'm also a graduate dean, and we talked about this a little bit, but I think, one thing we could do maybe at the summer training session would be to have a session. So, all of your universities have programs that do professional development for graduate students. Some of them have mentoring for junior faculty, but that's part of professional development, is teaching graduate students and junior faculty how to raise these issues with people who are above them, who are, have power over them. And those are hard conversations to have, but those are skills that you can develop. So that might be one start. And then there would be, maybe if you had a session on, essentially a professional development session in the summer session, then there would be that curriculum material would be on the website that could be replicated at universities. So that might be a way to do it.
That's interesting.
I don't know what came of it, but David Brockman and Neil Malhotra were talking about building infrastructure to facilitate hopefully more polite and less combative conversations about that, but I don't know what came of it.
So I'd be really interested in exploring more ways that you can apply this format to legislative reports and research inside of government, and if there's a template, or a lot of the themes carry over, but there are significant differences, and given how risk-averse agencies are, but also how low trust and confidence is in agencies right now, I think that there is a huge need and a benefit added by applying the open and transparency work there. And I think there's a lot of interest, I do know that, in agencies, but there's not a lot of understanding of how to go about doing that, or how to take the same concepts and apply them.
That's a great question. One thing I do want to point to is one of the folks who's here, I don't know if Fernando wants to say a word, but his dissertation is on, have you guys already connected? So he asked you to ask that question? Good job. Great. No, just kidding. But it's a great goal, and at the end of the day, this notion of using social science for social good, we won't do it if we don't connect with policymakers and sort of bring a lot of these tools to government policy as well. So thanks for that point. Maybe that should be another session actually in the Summer Institute. I mean, maybe it'd be worth having one of the hour lectures on exactly those linkages. So we may circle back.
We've talked some about working with science reporters and helping them, and this would be kind of an extension of that, of doing outreach to government agencies, because government agencies produce research and they consume research, right? And so, there would be so right now most of our BITS really is an academic research university focused movement, but there would be another potential for outreach to government agencies.
Yeah.
It just strikes me as the thought that, we're going into an era where I think scientists in government agencies, especially in the federal government, are going to find themselves sometimes in a bad position, and quite frankly, we're probably entering an era where science itself might feel it's under assault. And so I think it's really incumbent on us, speaking as a political scientist, that we really need to take this, really seriously now, to justify the value and merit of social science, and to sort of demonstrate that we're being credible. I think it's before, when we started BITS 5 years ago, we did it because it was the right thing to do. I think going forward, we're doing it because it's something that we're going to have to do.
I saw Don had a hand up back there. I don't know if there's a mic. Sorry. Okay, Adam and then Don. Okay, go ahead, Adam. Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah.
Going back to the question about replications, I guess I've been thinking about it a lot doing this research that I presented. How would we, maybe one of the problems that comes with comes from the animosity, is creating this animosity between people that are being replicated and replicators, is because of people being singled out. And at least I see the need for some kind of institution or some kind of way of selecting which papers to replicate, and replicating papers in a way that's more formal and more non-selective in this way, and maybe using my model or something. No, but basically, how can we build or help to create an institution that is non-biased in selecting papers to replicate, and where you kind of remove that animosity?
I thought that was the brilliance of their model, was multiple labs replicating multiple papers. And
Formally, more like...
yeah, to institutionalize that, not as a one-off, I agree, but even going from the one paper, one author to one paper, to many labs, to many studies at once, made it feel like a community effort.
So, another thing to do, my paper has been replicated, and I think it's an honor. I think it's like the greatest compliment that somebody wants to replicate your work. And so what I think authors should do, I think there needs to be new norms in our disciplines that you should see replication as a compliment, and that there ought to be a collaborative relationship between the author and the replicator. If they believe that their work has merit, then it should withstand that kind of scrutiny, and they should invite it and collaborate and help the replicators do the best job they can. And then if something turns out not to replicate, or you got something wrong in your original paper, you should be glad that's come to light, right? I mean, there shouldn't be. It doesn't need. I just think we need better norms for replication anyway. So,
I think Don had his hand up, and
I'm super interested in the replication thing, but I wanted to switch gears actually to a topic that has been kind of a recurrent theme of yesterday and today's session, which is exploratory analysis. So much of the resistance to the pre-specification of hypotheses seems to come down to this idea that you don't want to constrain yourself. And I can totally understand, and we're quite ecumenical actually in this group about meeting that criticism by saying, well, we're not against exploratory analysis, just don't tell us that your exploratory analysis was not exploratory analysis. Don't tell us that you thought of this, before you saw the data, which I think is good. But I want to actually go a little bit beyond that, because I know that's the official line, and the discussion with the journal editors in the last session made me think that a worthy research project would take the following form. What is the sort of actuarial odds that some exploratory proposition turns out to be true? So, we say, oh, it's very, very important for, this, that, or the other to be discovered through a process that's largely serendipitous, popping out the data, this or that, second order interaction effect or whatever. But I think that if we told people, you should know that we have kind of the equivalent of an actuarial table, like first order interactions, they replicate, outside your lab with a probability of like 0.1. And the triple interaction, it's like 1,000,000 to 1, okay? And you can't even find one in social science. And so I think that if we just had a little bit of that as like a baseline table, saying you might be the kind of person who's going to live to 130, you might be off the table. But if you're just an ordinary person, don't wax eloquent about your unexpected triple interaction, because it's almost never going to happen. It's like that. Was it the movie Double Indemnity, where they discover that there's been a murder because no one's ever been killed, no one's ever committed suicide by jumping off the back of a train, and that's how they know. And so it's kind of like that for our actual.
Yes, this is a little bit out of order now. It kind of goes back a little bit to just this question of who to replicate and how to select what is going to be replicated and what that process should be. And there was something that was kind of implied several times, mostly I think by Paul, unless I misunderstood him. I feel a little bad that now he's not here and I'm like stabbing him in the back or whatever. But this idea that somehow there ought to be some sort of random process is something I think I disagree with very vehemently. I would say, in fact, even the IRS audit that he seemed to cite is not random, is a function of your income. And I think that there's a natural tendency in people to want to replicate things that are influential. And I think that's the way it's supposed to be, because otherwise replication is going to be a waste of time. What's the point in replicating something that isn't, that isn't basically cited and doesn't have an influence on science? So I don't think it's a very major point, but it is something that, anyway, it goes back to something that's been touched upon multiple times, and I think what worries me a little bit is this idea of somehow institutionalizing and creating norms around what is okay to replicate and what isn't. And I don't feel like crying a river for somebody who did a very influential publication and then just gets replicated over and over. I think that's the way it's supposed to be.
There's a hand over back here. Oh, okay.
Yeah, so there was this earlier question about, how should we speak to the original researchers to get their cooperation. I haven't had anything that I've done replicated before, but it seems like when I look at some of these studies, the effort maybe in the replications, the effort people put into the details isn't of the same order maybe that the original authors put into the details. And that can be gleaned from the interaction they get over email. And there's this nice example that came up in this book by, I think it's Shadish, Cook, and Campbell. They have this nice little anecdote about endostatin and how people were unable to replicate this intervention that shrunk tumors. And again, no one was able to replicate it, but the original authors said it worked. And so eventually people had to come to their lab and figure out what was it that wasn't fully documented. Mm-hmm. And so there was kind of maybe more of an interest in the replicators to because they actually wanted to use this result rather than just replicate it.
Right.
So the motivation was a bit different, but when you're the original author and you don't really see that motivation, you have maybe less motivation to help. But I don't know. Maybe we should think, if we're replicators, to maybe assume the best from the original authors and assume that maybe there's some detail that wasn't documented or we're missing something.
And there was Paul's point about the only rewarding replicators who don't replicate creates the really terrible incentives, right? So if you can reward people for showing that a result replicates, then there might be more of this kind of collaborative relationship and attention to detail, yeah.
So I come from a life science background, and virtually any workshop on reproducibility has a very prominent role from funders, and funders in the life science, particularly the NIH, has started taking a very active role in driving discussions around reproducibility. And I'm wondering how much of that is going on in the social science space as well, and whether there's a role for funders in, also driving some of these discussions about what studies should be replicated and how that feeds into discussions about public policy. And yeah.
I think that's an interesting question. I mean, at least the kind of recent history that I'm aware of including some people in this room who've been involved in these discussions the last 4 or 5 years, there really was a community bubbling up of interest in a lot of different places. I think even before major funders got involved. You've heard of some of the funders just in the talks the last couple days, that the Arnold Foundation has been involved and the Sloan Foundation has been involved. So a number of funders have been involved in pushing work forward. And more recently, NSF has actually had some special calls related to research transparency in the social sciences. So I definitely think at this point, funders are involved, but at least from my vantage point, and I think Kevin I don't know if do you have the same perspective? I mean, in different fields, we all kind of found each other and started self-organizing, and I don't know what you think of it.
So the foundations are, have been, at least for BITS, I mean, you can look at the list of who's funding BITS, but what I think is interesting is I think there's a big culture difference between NIH and NSF, and NIH has always been farther ahead of the NSF on promoting, actually training graduate students in research ethics. Like, they just seem to take it more seriously for some reason. I think there's kind of cultural differences between the life sciences and physical sciences and engineering. And most of whatever federal funding we get is typically from NSF, and that tends to drive our incentives. But I think that there's a big difference between those two agencies.
Well, they just put out a request for information on pre-registered reports. The NIH did, which is sort of a huge step, actually, as far as I'm concerned, because I mean, we talked a little bit about the reaction to discussions about replications and just, you know, the threshold to engender culture shift being quite high. Well, it's immense in the life sciences. You know, and the reaction to replication as a kind of an agenda has been quite there have been a number of, you know, reactions to it that are not entirely welcoming, I would say. So
Yeah, the social sciences have always been a little bit behind on this than the life sciences and medicine, but I do think too that we've had a lot of discussions about there's some ways the social sciences are a bit out front too, and so that's kind of a thing that, you know, there's been a bit of a, you know, discussion in bits about how much we want to include biomedical sciences in what we're doing, and that, but there's, you know, to the extent we do, I think we really learn from each other. So.
Yeah, for sure. A lot of the early development of RCTs within the social sciences was inspired by medical trials. The registry, the AA registry, was, I think, pretty explicitly inspired by, you know, clinical trial registries in medicine. Maybe we'll take like a couple more comments because we're at 3, so maybe 2 more awesome questions.
This is more kind of a problem in need of a solution, and I don't really have that many ideas, but doing open, transparent, reproducible science is work, right? And that's something that I think all of us in this room recognize. And especially for early career researchers, putting a lot of time and effort into that when some of their peers maybe aren't can be difficult, especially if you have institutions or PIs who don't see the value in it as much.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if anyone has ideas of how do you incentivize it and make it more justifiable?
That is such a good question, and it kind of cuts in the opposite direction. My comment before was saying that these norms and policies can democratize social science research, potentially. The flip side, which a lot of, especially graduate students I've spoken with, have made, and I wish Fiona were still here. She presented, you gave that nice talk this morning. She's often sort of made this point in our discussions, is the extra time costs of all of this work may be particularly hard for graduate students to deal with who don't have RAs and staff and a lab set up.
But it's easier to do the better you are at it. And so especially as grad students, if grad students can really build this into their training, and essentially if you build in, so really what transparency asks you to do is to do a lot of planning on the front end. And doing that, it does take more time on the front end, but then, you know, in some ways that makes things a lot easier on the back end. That, you know, like, you know, sometimes if you don't document very well, you end up losing a whole day when you go back to try to replicate what you just did. You can spend a whole day trying to remember, well, how did I do that, right? And so I think that that if you build in your training really good standard operating procedures of planning to be transparent as you're beginning a project, and you anticipate doing that, then it ends up being at least time neutral, if not time savings. But if you don't do that, and then you know, trying to reconstruct it on the back end, it'll seem time consuming. So that's the best I think we can do.
Can you shout out Richard's tier protocol? That's a really good, useful tool.
Is Richard here, actually? He's back there. So Richard Ball heads up Project Tier. I don't know if Richard wants to say a word about it, but it's really been an attempt to standardize the work process, and yeah.
Yeah, so short overview is projecttier.org, TIER. And it grew out of teaching undergraduates to make sure that their introductory statistics class research papers were fully transparent and reproducible. And it took about 5 years of refining instructions to get them to understand what we're telling them to do so that they could turn in data files and command files all organized with the README file, so that as I grade their papers, I just go click, 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 and see everything happening live in front of me. And it's just a simple way of make a folder called the data folder, and in that put your data. Make a folder called your command file folder, and put your command files in there. But if you go to projecttier.org, you don't have to make the handout for your students. You can send them to our website or download it in PDF, and that's probably enough of a overview. So, but I'd be happy to chat with people and.
Thanks, Richard. Did you have a comment? Yeah.
So I'd like to make a comment about replicating and incentivizing replication. So I felt that in talking about this throughout the conference, there's been this implicit assumption that there's basically just two straightforward ways to do replications. And the first is a direct replication. You take the original study, you do the exact same method, you do the exact same analysis. Do I get the same p-value, Bayes factor, whatever? And then the second is the conceptual replication. You take the method, put it into a different context, but then look for the same effect, basically do the same analysis. What is the p-value? What is the Bayes factor? And I think that that's very restrictive, especially for the people in this audience, where all of us are already incentivized to do replications. There's a lot of room for creativity in replications. And I think that we often think of it as a drudgery, as something that like every grad student should do at least one and just do it, get it out of the way. And there's no incentive structure for it. And that's why I find, I like the project that I'm working on right now, the plan meta-analysis, where it's a new way of replicating an effect. You do hundreds of mini experiments in a very short amount of time, and then we developed a new statistical analysis to analyze that data. So there was creative modeling work involved in that. So it's not just a new way to replicate, but a way that makes it interesting for researchers, so that it becomes less of a drudgery. And another thing that I've done in my personal work is I guess this is sort of a replication. I took a neural and behavioral data set collected by a neuroscience lab, and I developed a new Bayesian model to analyze it when they had just done t-tests. And I think that's another way to make it more creative and attractive for researchers, is that you can have this creative bent and look at things in a different way where a different researcher would not have looked at it before. And I think there's a lot of diverse ways to do replication, more than just repeat the same thing, see if you get the same thing again. Yeah.
And that's what I was thinking as well.
fantastic.
When the replication is collaborative between the replicator and the original author, the author ought to see that as learning new things about the paper that they wrote, and it should be a welcome thing, right? And so so in that sense, it's like an extension of the original project, but it could be collaborative and constructive, and it really should be, rather than adversarial. And it just has to be with the way we currently frame it, I think.
Okay, before we wrap up, I just want to thank BIT's staff. Garrett is here, Kelsey is here. Kelsey. Katie is back there. Where's Jen? Is Jen here? There's Jen. For really a great two-day conference. I want to thank other SIGA staff. I see Jeanette back there, and others from SIGA who've really helped put this together. And really just, I think we're grateful for all the panel participants. We're grateful that Ed Lemer could come up from UCLA again, and some of our donors have been here. So really, it was a great meeting. I hope this is just the beginning of the conversations, and we just keep it going, even after the meeting ends. So thanks again, everybody.
And see you all next year.
I'll make one comment, which is that we're already